pornography, gender confusion and dysphoria, same-sex attraction, masturbation, peer pressure, the hookup culture, and the sex talk. These are all hard topics, and like every parent that's ever lived, maybe you have nervously wondered about these types of conversations. What should I talk about with my kids, and when should I talk to them? Well, today we're going to first cover why it is important to have these conversations with your children in the first place, and why we should all care about them deeply. And then we will move into more of a practical application of how to have these conversations and what they should look like. As your children age, it is my hope that you've already had a basic conversation with them about relationships and how sexuality fits into God's design of relationships, setting the stage for them to have more mature talks as they grow. But if you haven't yet, don't worry. We're going to reference a great resource for you and take a look at the information in that resource from Harvest USA, which is a nonprofit that talks about gospel-centered sexuality. If you haven't started, don't worry. It really is never too late, no matter how young or old your kids are. Your students need to hear about sexuality and relationships through a gospel-centered perspective, and that's what we're going to focus on today. Before we go anywhere, though, we need to start talking about why it's so important to have these conversations with kids when they're so young. And more importantly, why continue talking about them when it can be just plain awkward, to be quite frank. If you notice anything about what the world is teaching your students and your children about relationships, chances are it's not really good. So we're going to take a quick look at a snapshot of what the culture is teaching them. 70% of students will have their first sexual experience by the age of 19. A surprisingly high number of teenagers involved in religious communities actually identify as being in the LGBTQ plus community. The highest reports say up to 14%, and less than 1% of them feel as if they can talk to their church leadership about what they're struggling with. If you leave the church and just talk about the world in general, that number increases exponentially. Pornography has gotten so out of control that it has actually been labeled a public health crisis. Friends with benefits has become a more appealing relationship status to young adults than committed relationships. And marriage has unfortunately become so trivial, or it's failing at such a high rate, that some lawmakers have actually considered things like a 2-year marriage license instead of a lifetime covenantal commitment. Pornography sites receive more regular traffic than Amazon, Netflix, and Twitter combined. 50% of adults don't think that pornography is wrong, and most teenagers are encouraging, neutral, or indifferent about their opinions about pornography. They just say that it's no big deal. 50% of Christian men have struggled or are struggling with pornography, and 1/3 of pornography viewers are women. It's not just a guy problem anymore. Nearly 1.5 million high school students nationwide, this is just in the United States, experience physical abuse from a dating partner in 1 year. Depression and anxiety rates have hit an all-time high in the teenage population, especially today with the COVID-19 pandemic, when they're trying to juggle almost everything being online and on their phones. We weren't made to do that, but now that we are in this pandemic, the real connection we were made for is so much harder to get. Before, teenagers were just distracted by their phones, and now it's nearly impossible to get away from your phone. That's the snapshot of the culture we're living in, the culture that our teens are unfortunately having to and trying to navigate. And if we just look at that snapshot, it can leave us feeling hopeless. The good news is, though, that the Bible does have a lot to say about dating and all of these topics. And that's what the curriculum, Abundant Life, You Were Made for More, that Anglicans for Life and I have created, talks about. Dating in this culture is so hard. And I can say that with certainty and confidence because I did it. As a Christian, too, the word dating is not explicitly used in the Bible, so it can be even harder to navigate how God calls us to live within this realm of dating. Dating is a rather new cultural idea, and we as the church are people trying to figure out how to live in this in-between time. We're trying to figure out how to live in the world and honor the Lord in that and live in the culture by honoring the Lord. So that's kind of a little bit of what we're going to talk about today. But here's what I want to say before we jump into this. And I want you to remember this and encourage any student or child who you're talking about these things with. There may not be explicit guidelines for dating in the Bible, but there are guidelines for holiness. And I believe that that's enough to teach us how to live in this in-between time. God doesn't call you or your students or your children to be perfect. He doesn't call you to be straight. And he might not even call you to be married. But he certainly calls each and every one of us to be holy. Our pursuit of holiness will look differently for each of us, but it doesn't change the end goal. We are called to be holy in every relationship we have and to pursue that holiness. Now, in the public sector, you'll notice that the word abstinence isn't really used that much anymore. Instead, we have switched that terminology to sexual risk avoidance because it is more indicative of the goal we're actually trying to accomplish. We want to help students see that their whole self is affected by their sexual decisions, not just their physical self. So as we talk about this idea of how and why to talk to your kids about these topics, I want you to remember that we aren't just talking about abstinence anymore. We're talking about holiness and how that penetrates into every aspect of who they are. And here's another thing I want you to remember. Social media, mobile phones, and the world that we inhabit are problematic. But they're not the primary problems for our teens. Drinking, drugs, sex, eating disorders, pornography, cutting, perfectionism, stress, and depression aren't our teenagers' foundational problems. Jesus tells us there is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of that person are what defile him. We read that in Mark 7, verse 15. While these outside influences are sources of temptation to us and to our teenagers, our own fallen nature leads us to think and act sinfully. The negative behaviors we fear then are byproducts of what's actually going on in our idolatrous hearts. The heart is the problem for our teenagers and also for us. The heart is why we crave our phones more often than we crave going into the Word and meeting with our Savior. Now, I'm not by any means suggesting that temptation shouldn't be taken seriously. Certainly, rules and boundaries should be in place for your children and your teenagers. But if we only address what's on the surface, the easily seen sin in their lives, and we don't actually help our teens dig down to the ruling idols of their hearts, we're never going to facilitate real change. That's why it's so important to point teens toward Jesus first. And once we are confident that the gospel is being portrayed and displayed to them in our lives, we are called to start having these hard but necessary conversations with them about topics that, frankly, we'd all like to avoid. The harsh reality that I want you to hear, though, is that if you don't talk to your kids about their identity and how that identity shapes how they interact with the world, somebody else will talk to them. First, I want to start by saying you really can't control what your children see. That's just the way it is these days with technology, social media, and all the influences that they're being that are coming into their lives. The best that we can do as parents and as people who are put in a place to love students is to be proactive and open up conversations so that our children feel comfortable having conversations with us about what they're seeing, experiencing, and what they're hearing, and what they see their peers doing around them. That's a huge one. Topics that are left out of conversations at home are actually left up to others. Where there's a void of influence at home, it will be taken up by the culture at large. This idea isn't just hypothetical. Unfortunately, I have seen it to be true as a youth leader time and time again, as parents come and talk to me and share stories about what they're dealing with their students. So let's start with those parents listening who have young children. I mentioned Harvest USA before. They have came out with a great resource for parents with kids of all ages by breaking up childhood and adolescence into phases. And then they kind of go through and give guidelines about what to say about sex and relationships. Believe it or not, most people are shocked when I say this, but this starts with young children from ages 2 to 7. And Harvest USA puts them in this stage called the grammar stage. This stage is actually very important. Your child is probably as curious as they will ever be. They ask tons, if you have a 2-year-old, you know, they ask tons of questions. They're learning to communicate, and they want legitimate answers from you. They don't want these answers that you come up with to appease them, right? So we're gonna talk about some tips on how to handle conversations at this age regarding sexuality and relationships. First, we want to make sure that we're teaching parts of the body and their function. We also want to teach kids about safety and appropriate privacy about touching other people and touching themselves and what that looks like. It's also key in this stage, again, their ages 2 to 7, so they're young, but you want to affirm your child's gender. This one is really important to emphasize that God created us male and female, and that you don't have to fit into the stereotypes of what girls should or shouldn't do and what boys should or shouldn't play with, or vice versa. But you want to affirm that biological sex is matching up with their identity. You want to be wise about technology usage and access, as these ages, even though sometimes it may be easier to just take your child in front of a device so you can get stuff done. Science has proven, I'm sure that you have read this as a parent, that screen time is not actually beneficial for them to do that in large amounts of time. So beware of that, monitor it, have protection set up. You also want to begin conversations on sex and sexuality. If your child asks you the question, where do babies come from? Answer in an age-appropriate way. I don't have time in this workshop to cover all of the tough questions you will get as a parent, but I'm sure in your head you can pull out a few that you've gotten already. If you do need additional material to help you do this, that's why Abundant Life, You Were Made for More was created. Again, the goal is setting up at this stage of their lives, ages 2 to 7, you want to set the stage for further conversations to take place as they age. Research has found that when children ask about body parts at this age, answering their questions honestly, and this is the key, with anatomically correct terms is actually the best thing to do. Even if you think nicknaming the parts of the body seems to be better because they are young, it's actually harder for kids as they age to have serious and nonchalant conversations about how God made our bodies to function when we're using these silly nicknames. Think about it. We really do not nickname any other body part because that's what they are. They're body parts. And the more that we normalize this with our children, the less awkward our children will feel talking with us about them as they age. So, if you have a child in the age group of 8 to 12, your child is entering what we call the tween stage. In this stage, experts say that teaching is the main emphasis. So teaching is the main emphasis. That means that you want to make sure that you are having intentionally deep conversations on sex and sexuality. You want to talk about specifics about body parts and mechanisms that they're learning about. Again, they're going to be learning about these things in their school health classes. So not talking with them about it is actually setting them up just to be hearing from a teacher about it. You want to be proactive in that. Again, if this stage is set up from the previous grammar stage of ages 2 to 7, if the stage is set well, it's going to be much, much easier to continue these conversations. If you've already passed this stage, if you're listening to this and you are in this stage and you haven't even approached these conversations with your kids, don't worry. Every conversation is redeemable, and we're going to talk more about that later, about how to do these things realistically and practically. So stay with me if that is you. This stage, the tween stage, is where kids actually enter puberty, and it's important that as parents, you are the one shepherding them well by discussing body changes and the emergence of sexual desires. This is a stage where you want to introduce the dangers of pornography. If you're not aware, the average age that a student will be exposed to pornography is age 11. However, the most recent reports are saying that age actually has dropped to 8 years of age. So you need to be proactive in that. You want to solidly implement safe technology usage, again, to protect them from being exposed to that. And make sure that your child knows the appropriate boundaries that you've put in place. You want to affirm what marriage is biblically between a man and a woman. Again, hitting on those genders is very important. You want to teach about sexual brokenness in all of its forms. And finally, all of these conversations need to be wrapped up by teaching respect for all people while affirming biblical norms. Now, teenagers are considered to be in the age of 13 to 18. And in this phase, remember the tween stage, teaching was the key. In this stage, dialogue is more important than ever. That's the word I want you to remember, is dialogue. There should be an increased focus, when possible, on discussions about sexuality with the same gender parent. So if you are a dad and you have a son, you should be talking to your son about sex and sexuality. If you are a mom and you have a daughter, you should be talking with your daughter. This is important because God's grace and redemption can be displayed when sharing and talking about challenges and past mistakes that you have had as a parent and what your sexual history has looked like. Again, relating appropriately as they grow older toward adulthood. So the way you talk to a 13-year-old is not going to be the same as you talk to your 18-year-old adult child, right? You want to remember to gauge these conversations for whatever age that they're at. Throughout this stage, you should also be having conversations about how the culture around them is influencing them and how that interacts with scripture. Again, remember that your child may not believe everything that you want to believe, everything that you want them to believe. But it is important that they feel comfortable and are open enough with you that they are actually willing to share what they believe, not just what they think you want to hear. You want them to be able to share with you what they actually believe so that you can point them toward the Bible, toward scripture, and what God has to say about that. Again, previous stages, if the grammar stage and the tween stage are done well, it's gonna set them up well for this. So we've covered the 3 phases: the grammar stage, the tween stage, and the teen phase. Now I want to talk about how do we do this. It really can seem impossible and overwhelming and intimidating as a parent who is also broken and in need of the gospel. But it is very possible, and I just want to give you a few tips that are going to set you up to do this. So 1, be positive. Have a message that is more than the guidelines and the boundaries and the rules. You want to have a message that tells the overarching story of the gospel. Something we really emphasize in the Abundant Life curriculum that I've referenced before, that I wrote in conjunction with Anglicans for Life, is that the behavior modifications are not going to do the trick. Teaching your child right and wrong may not even do the trick, as I'm sure many of you can attest to personally. It's about pointing students to the gospel, to God, and his plan for their lives through the love of Jesus. That's really going to encourage students to grab a hold of their identity in him, thus encouraging them to live for him. Do's and don'ts aren't enough anymore. We really need to point them to the bigger picture. And the cool thing is, like we talked about, we can start doing that from a very young age. From that age group of 2 to 7, you can talk to them about gender roles, how God created them as a man and a woman, what marriage is, and what that looks like in relationship with the Bible. Second point, remember and emphasize that the only motivation for obedience to the rules that you're teaching them is out of love for and in obedience to Christ. It's important to teach them that unsatisfied desires don't go away when you get married. Some people don't even get married if that's not what the Lord has called you to. Sexual relationships with a spouse may be difficult and challenging, and promising your child, your teenager, that sexual relationship will be great and easy if they wait for marriage to have sex is not the way to go. In many cases, this can set their expectations so high that no spouse will ever be able to meet up to them, and can set them up as having an expectation for marriage that will never be fulfilled. The third point, whether you're a parent, a youth leader, an adult mentor, a grandparent who's listening to this message, is that you want your marriage to be a testimony of why marriage is worth waiting for. If you have children, I highly encourage you to make sure that you prioritize and make sure that your children see the hard work that you and your spouse put into loving one another, that it isn't always easy, that you have to learn about one another and continually pursue one another. Marriage worth waiting for is glorious because it's an absolutely beautiful picture of God's redemptive plan for our world. And that's what you should aim to portray to children and students in your life. So in closing, the most important thing you can do for your students or children is to show up for them in these places of vulnerability and fight for their hearts in a culture that so badly wants to take them away. From one parent to another, God bless you as you do so.